Last week, I introduced you to this idea that the first 8 or 9 chapters of Revelation follow almost exactly the opening ceremonies to the Olympic Games in the first century. The purpose of that was to put you and myself in the mindset of the people who would have been hearing it, who would have been hearing this spoken to them, this story, this vision that John got. These series of events would have caused those people who heard it initially to wonder, and it's a question that I'd love for you to wonder about as well. Who will win this cosmic battle? Who will the victor be? Who comes out on top? Which deity reigns victorious? And today we're going to find out the answer to that question. But before we do, I want to make a quick note about something that's historically very important to Christians, and something that you might be wondering about right now as I'm posing this question that you almost inevitably know the answer to. And that is something we call chosen anticipation. Chosen anticipation is when we decide that we are going to await something that we know is coming, something where we know the outcome. It is guaranteed and it is certain. We are sure of it. Westerners struggle with this. We don't have this built into our culture. We don't wait well. We certainly don't wait on purpose. Why would we choose to wait when we don't have to? We've grown up in a place, in a country, in a culture where the rate at which something is available to me or comes to me is the highest measure of that company or service's value. We don't wait. We certainly don't choose to wait unless we absolutely have to. Why choose to sit in a longer line or engage in a slower method of something when there's something like self-checkout or drones that deliver packages same day? Why walk somewhere when you have a car and Waze that can shave like 20 seconds off your arrival time? Why choose to anticipate something when you know the outcome is readily available right there for you? But when we choose to anticipate something, when we choose to wait for something, to wait for an outcome, it changes the way that we understand the outcome itself, and we right-size the value of that thing. If you've been a part of our church for any length of time or any other church that participates in and celebrates their church calendar, you do this at least twice a year. You do this in the season of Advent leading up to Christmas Day and the birth of the Messiah, and you do this in the season of Lent leading up to Easter Sunday and the resurrection of the Messiah. Nobody is going throughout the month of December, throughout the season of Advent going, I wonder how this thing ends, right? Nobody is going throughout the season of Lent going, gosh, it really sucks that guy died and he's dead forever and ever. We know that birth is on the other end. We know that resurrection is on the other end, right? And yet we choose to anticipate and wait anyways. We choose to wait in these seasons. We choose to hope. We choose to wonder, not because we don't know how it ends, but precisely because we do know how it ends. And we want to savor the journey to get there. And this is very much the case with the book of Revelation. For many of you, the ending won't be a surprise. Probably for all of you, the ending won't be a surprise. You know how this thing goes. But for several weeks now, you have participated in a chosen anticipation, waiting to see what will happen in this cosmic Olympic Games, this cosmic event among deities. It is also vital for our enjoyment and appreciation of this book to embrace things like metaphor and imagery and the beautiful literature that it is. We want a literal interpretation of so many things, especially when it comes to faith and the Bible, but that is not what we are presented with the book of Revelation. We are presented with a work of art, beautiful literature that in and of itself should stir something in us. It's not only beautiful literature, but it is at least that. I was listening to comedian Pete Holmes talk on a podcast the other day, and he said that some truths are so big that they must be told with lies. And he's using provocative language there, lies, to kind of grab our attention. But his point being, metaphor, something that represents something else, is sometimes the only way we can tell the story as big as the story of the Bible or as big as the story of Revelation. He went on to say that literal truth is the most boring kind, and I think he's right. I think truth that causes us to work a little, to make us fight to figure things out a little bit. Truth that draws us into a storyline, that's more interesting. That's more beautiful in a lot of ways. He's not saying, and I'm not saying, that the Bible is just filled with lies. That's not the point of this at all. I feel like that's the quote that's going to get pulled from the podcast or whatever. The point is this: the Bible, especially Revelation, is an enormous truth to be told. It's so big, in fact, that it requires metaphor and interpretation. And as I said in the first week of this series, work. And my invitation to you all along, and it is pretty much every single week, is that you join us in the work of studying this incredible book, this Bible that we've been given. It takes work. It does take some work and some time. A few reminders before we jump into the homily proper. Things we've been talking about all along. I want to remind you of these things. First, Revelation was written to be a blessing, particularly to the people that initially heard it. It is not written to us, but it certainly has something for us. I believe one of the things that it has for us is a continued blessing, that the blessing would be available to us, although in a different way. Second, Revelation is a rich story about a classic conflict between good and evil, God and anti-God. It is meant to invoke in us worship and awe, just to be floored by the events of the thing. It is meant to be a blessing to you and to invoke in you worship. Third, by the work of Christ, we too are included in this family of God. When Revelation speaks of God's people preserved, we are included in that as well through the work of Christ. Christ's work seals us into that family as well. And fourth, war, pain, suffering, even if the outcome is good, is still bitter, and we are to lament it. Even if good triumphs over evil in microcosms of Revelation in our life and lifetime, we should still lament that there is so much pain and so much warfare in its path. What follows will be a homily in 3 parts. First, the fall of Babylon. Second, the millennial reign of Christ. And third, a new heaven and a new earth. We have a lot of work to do, so just bear with me. I'm looking at the time here, don't worry. Chapter 18 starts like this. After this, I saw another angel come down from heaven, and he had a great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. With a mighty voice he shouted, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling for demons and a haunt for every impure spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, and a haunt for every unclean and detestable animal. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries." The chapter goes on, and even before that, there's mention of Babylon, and I think Babylon is a fascinating choice in this particular text. We don't know if God gives Babylon to John as the name of the city that is represented in this vision, or if John chooses Babylon because the description of the city matches that of Babylon. We don't really know. But either way, God or John or both chose Babylon as the name to be used here, which I find to be fascinating. Here's a quick pop quiz. Is Babylon in power when John writes this vision down? No. Babylon's not in power. Who is in power? Rome. Very good. A little bit of participation this morning. Great job. Rome's in power. Domitian is Caesar, ruler of the Roman Empire. Yet Babylon is chosen for this story. Why not Rome? Why isn't Rome chosen in this particular vision? In 597 BCE, under the rule of King Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon laid siege to Jerusalem, and God's people were taken captive. The book of Jeremiah records the siege. The book of Lamentations recounts the deep grief for what looked like the genocide of God's people. The book of Daniel is part history, part prophecy, part apocalyptic vision, and it takes place in Babylonian captivity. Those are just a few examples of Babylon taking a really, really prominent section of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible. It would have been burned into the Hebrew memory, the effect that Babylon had. But that was nearly 700 years prior to John's vision, so why does it make an appearance here? A couple of reasons. First, remember, John is using Old Testament language to make sense of a New Testament era vision. John is calling on something that they would have been familiar with. He does this with the book of Daniel and the book of Jeremiah and the book of Ezekiel and a bunch of different Jewish Hebrew books in order to make sense of this vision to the people. They would have been able to call this to memory. So he's relating to them. As I've said before, you cannot read the book of Revelation and understand it well without your Old Testament ready and handy and ideally familiar. Second reason why it shows up. Babylon represents an idea. Babylon isn't just a city that ruled at one time and took the people of God captive. Babylon represents the idea of an unbeatable force, an unstoppable power, an invincible enemy. Jeremiah prophesies to God's people that they would get to go home after 70 years, and I'm sure that prophecy, that this unbeatable, invincible empire would topple at some point, would have been so wild, it may have even been laughable. There's no way that they believed him. They must have scoffed at that. In their mind, the Jews were doomed because Babylon was known in the region to be too great to fall and too good at genocide for them to come out on top. And this is true of other rulers and cities as well. Rome in the first century is one of those. It was not considered the kind of city that was easily toppled, especially not by a weaker, poorer nation. To talk about the fall of Babylon would have been reminding to the hearers that even the most impossible to topple empires would be subject to the good of God someday. It would have been so hopeful, it may have even been laughable. A total long shot, and exactly the kind of long shot the people of God had started to bet on at that point. A bet on God's goodness in the face of tyranny is a good bet. To put it in perspective 2,000 years later, it would be similar to saying that the United States of America would fall to another empire soon, and that other empire would be a smaller empire. It would be an empire with less resources. It would be an empire with no allies, and somehow it would overtake the United States of America. Now, if I said that to you and said, that is imminent, that's happening very soon, you might laugh. You might think there's no way. But if you were being hunted by your government, if you were being persecuted by state-sponsored torture and death, you would find great hope in that. You would find it to be the most hopeful thing in the world. Impossible and yet beautifully hopeful. Last week I said that the book of Revelation has something to tell us about empire in every chronological direction. And it tells us that empire will rule and oppress all of human history, and that is true. But the book also tells us that empires will fall. God is great, and evil will not prevail. Even if they do for a time, even if it feels like a lifetime, empires will not last, like in Babylon, like in Rome, like in Nazi Germany, like in terrorist organizations around the world. They will not outlast or outpace the goodness of God. Part 2. The book of Revelation is used by theologians to develop something called eschatology. If just at the mention of that word you get a little sleepy and you think, this is about the time I'm going to take a nap, just hang tight. I'm going to move really quickly in this first part here, okay? This is a theological position on the end times. A theological position on the end times. Books like Daniel, for instance, talk about this kind of thing, but the book of Revelation is heavily used in developing what's called eschatology. Prominently, chapter 20 of Revelation is the primary chapter in the entire Bible used to develop people's eschatology. You may or may not have heard of terms like premillennialism, postmillennialism, amillennialism. If you have heard of them, don't say anything, because then we'll all know who the nerds are. I love this stuff. I could talk about it all day, but I'm not going to. I'd love to talk with you about it more some other time if you'd like. These are features of eschatology that deal with Revelation chapter 20 specifically. That's it. Books, position papers, graduate and doctorate level classes center around this chapter alone. Churches have formed and split on the interpretation of this specific chapter. Historically, it's been a really big deal for Christians. Strangely, it's just the one chapter. We're 20 chapters into the wildest book in the New Testament, and this is the chapter that people will absolutely hang their hat on at times. I'm not to get into the details of the actual positions or anything like that, but I do think it matters for you and I a little bit how we understand this or how we receive this, because I believe that it's a picture of what happens when God wins. It's not just about the overturning of evil empire. It's also about when good gets to reign and good gets to rule. God wins and defeats this evil empire in this classic conflict of good and evil, but the beauty of the story isn't just that evil is defeated, it's that good gets to rule. Chapter 20 is about 1,000-year reign of Jesus on earth. 1,000-year reign, that's where we get the term millennialism from. Now, when we hear 1,000 years, it sounds to us like the beginning of a word problem, right? Like we think about numbers mathematically in the West, but an Easterner who would have heard this even then and even now would have thought of something representative, because numbers represented ideas. They represented concepts. 1,000 years wasn't meant to be specific. 1,000 years was meant to indicate, to warn them about a very long length of time, an epoch, an era. a length of time that would be almost unfathomable to them, especially at that time. But even still today, it would have been unfathomable to us. Think about 1,000 years from now. The year will be 3023. And that's pretty hard to imagine. It's pretty hard for us to comprehend that, to imagine what life would be like. It's hard to imagine what things will be like 100 years from now, not to mention what the 3000s will be like. Will there be another millennial generation named after the turn of the millennium? I don't know. It's a great question. The millennium begins with Jesus throwing Satan into the abyss. It's significant when we read it as it is. But when we have a grasp on the language that was originally written in, we learn something new and something fresh, something that they would have had readily available in their memory as they were listening to this story told to begin with. There's this abyss, and in the abyss, there's chaos. And God throws Satan into the abyss. God takes chaos and throws it into chaos, and in doing so brings about peace, brings about shalom, brings about wholeness, brings about health, brings about this millennial reign. It all starts with the abyss, where chaos is represented and chaos is swirling, and all of a sudden it's made right, there's order, there's peace, there's shalom. There's another abyss mentioned in the Bible that you may have heard of before. It's in the Old Testament, to be more specific. It's right at the beginning, to be exact, and it goes like this. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the abyss, or the deep. And the Spirit of God moved about the face of the waters. This is Genesis 1, verse 2. The word abyss is used in both cases. In both cases, there was chaos in the void, in the abyss, and God makes peace in the chaos. The Bible is bookended by shalom taking place in the face of chaos. Imagine if your life was chaos all the time. In the first century in Rome, they were thinking about, my life is chaos all the time because I'm wondering if I'm going to make it through the week or if my neighbors or friends are going to make it through the week. And maybe for you, it's not because your government is hunting you down. Maybe it's internal. Maybe it's mental illness. Maybe it's an addiction. Maybe it's a physical illness. Maybe it's a broken relationship that frustrates and infuriates you daily. Maybe it's a job. Maybe it's your mother-in-law. I have no idea what it is that causes chaos in your life. And I certainly don't mean to minimize the life-threatening persecution that many face around the world. But chaos comes in many shapes and sizes. This is relatable for us. When God takes chaos and throws it into chaos and makes peace and order in the face of chaos, there's great hope for you and I, who oftentimes face chaos in our life. When life itself is chaos, remember that the book ends of the Bible, God brings about shalom in the chaotic abyss. And I think it's a mistake, in the same way that I think it's a mistake to say that these toppling empires were really only about one specific time, or they will be about one specific time. I think it's a mistake to say the same thing about the rule and reign of Christ, about the bringing about of shalom in the face of chaos. It was true when Pharaoh went down. It was true when Babylon went down. It was true when Rome went down and when Nazi Germany went down. And plenty of times in our own country and in countries outside of us, both in the past and the present and the future, that God has brought about peace and shalom and wholeness in the face of chaos and calamity over and over and over again. Remember, Revelation is about the fall of empire and the rule of good in every chronological direction. It's happening over and over and over again. Part 3. Lastly, in the book of Revelation, it ends with a new heaven and a new earth. Chapter 21 starts like this. And then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making all things new." After the fall of one representative city, a city that represents destruction and chaos and something that seemingly was invincible, We see the descending of a city that was meant to represent righteousness, that was meant to represent beauty, meant to represent shalom and purity and wholeness. This descends, and the whole heavens and the whole earth become this city, becomes this city of righteousness, descending to the earth and representing what happens when good God wins. That's what this city represents. And Jesus sits on the throne and says, "Behold, I'm making all things new." A couple of nights ago, our elders were together for one of our monthly meetings, and we were starting to have some conversations around codifying theology and doctrine, some things that are at the foundation of what our church believes. And we're doing this in the way of dialogue and question asking, question answering, and it's been a wonderful experience. But the question that we discussed a couple of nights ago was, who is God? And we talked about the relational nature of God and the loving nature of God and the creative nature of God. And this particular verse came up more than once. Behold, I am making all things new. God made, and God is making, and God will continue to make. We serve a making God. We worship a making God, a God that has made and will make all things new. I told you at the beginning of the year that there's a primary question we should be asking when we're reading the Bible being the most comprehensive revelation of God available to us. We oftentimes skip in our reading of the Bible, and we skip to what does this mean for me? How do I live? Or actually, more popularly, we read the Bible and we think, how does that mean so-and-so should live? This person that I know, this neighbor, this family member, this friend. What does this Bible verse say about how they should live? Sometimes we think about ourselves. A lot of times it's about someone else. The primary question, at least the initial question we should be asking, is what does this tell me about the kingdom and character of God? If it is primarily a comprehensive revelation of who God is, then that's the question that it's answering over and over and over again. Who is God? What does this tell me about the kingdom and character of God? Behold, I am making all things new. This tells me primarily about the kingdom and character of God. The book of Revelation tells me that God is making all things new. It doesn't always feel like it. We don't always experience it. We don't always know where to find it. But where there is made new, there are things made new. That is where God is at work. This is the kingdom and the character of God. This book is meant to be a blessing to you, and I hope it was exactly that. I hope that you return to this book to receive the same blessing over and over and over again. Let's pray. God, thank you for the book of Revelation. Thank you for bringing order to chaos. And thank you for making all things new. In the face of constant chaos, calamity, war, pain, suffering, internal and external, you are the God who makes all things new. May that be front of mind, deeply embedded in our hearts, and perhaps on our lips even this week as we're talking to friends, family, neighbors about who you are. We love you, and we pray these things in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.